There's a belief in the GOP and some conservative circles that a government-created safety net just creates a lazy working class, so that the very presence of programs designed to cushion against unemployment, disease, poverty, sap the moral fortitude of an individual's bootstrapping tendencies. But what if those safety nets were just kicked away? What kind of society would we see? Would we see a kind of libertarian utopia bubble up? Or perhaps a proto-fascist state? Well, we don't have to speculate. We can just look at the reality of Greece. And it isn't pretty. With me on Truthout, interviews to discuss her article, Neoliberalism as Social Necrophilia, The Case of Greece, that was published on Truthout, is Panayota Gounari. She's an associate professor of applied linguistics at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. Hi, Panayota. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. So my first question really is, it's very simple. How bad is it in Greece? How much have these austerity programs in the country affected the people there?
Things are really bad. Actually, just last night, a UNICEF report was released. And I know in my article I mentioned that children living in the threshold of poverty are 450,000. Well, the new report, as of last night, they're actually 686,000 just from 2011. And this is just, a number that shifted just now. So, the situation is a humanitarian crisis.
And you just published this article a couple of weeks ago, and as of this recording. And so just in that small space of time, it's just gotten much worse.
Unemployment is over 30%. I know official accounts bring it to 30%, but it's much more than that. And unemployment among young people is over 60%. As I'm mentioning in my article, there are 300,000 people without electricity in Athens. We're not talking about a developing country. We're talking about a member state of the European Union.
We like to say it's the cradle of democracy. This is where a lot of Western philosophy comes out. A lot of the ideas that frame the countries that I live in the United States. You live here now in the United States, but Europe, the United States, Canada. You look at Greece, and now they are just in such dire straits. It's heartbreaking, and it's just shocking, really.
Yes, it is shocking, but I think we have to look at the causes of the problem, and because what's happening in Greece, I think, is an implementation of an experiment that started many years ago in Chile, and which was the first known experiment of neoliberalism. And I think what we see right now is an application of this experiment, but really taking it to the extremes.
Well, let's talk a little bit about neoliberalism. The term itself can be confusing, especially to ears in the United States, because we tend to associate the term liberal with a party or people that tend to support the government in terms of creating social safety nets and programs to cushion the blow against capitalism. But the term neoliberalism, like I said, is confusing because it's got the term liberal in it. So maybe you could explain what exactly the ideology is.
Well, neoliberalism is an economical theory, okay? And neoliberalism is an expression of capitalism. So we're not really talking about very different things. We're talking about a particular expression of capitalism. And neoliberalism, as I mentioned earlier to you, started in Chile, where the so-called Chicago boys, those were the people working around Milton Friedman, who was then teaching at the University of Chicago, were invited to restructure the Chilean economy. And I just want to remind you that this happened after a coup d'etat, okay, that overthrew the democratically elected Salvador Allende government and established a dictatorship. So
we're talking in the 70s at this point. Then
actually, it was September 11th, 1973. They called it the small September 11th. So these guys went in and they pretty much did, with the collaboration of the IMF, they did what's happening right now in Greece. So they privatized the public resources, they implemented austerity measures, there was militarization, they invited foreign investment into the country, creating optimal conditions, of course, for investment, but without safeguarding that any of the profits would stay in the country, really. So the profit went 100% to foreign capitalists, basically. And there was an initial success, but it was short-lived because the country went into major recession after that. And the same happened in most of Latin America when similar things happened. So this particular economic doctrine really puts at the center what they call the freedom to choose. So you're free to choose, you're free to be an entrepreneur. They assume that market is going to be self-regulated in some magical way because the state should only have policing or surveillance functions, and the state should also be there as an auxiliary to help create a positive climate for entrepreneurship. So they're really advocating for minimal government, which also means shrinking the welfare and social functions of the state.
You see, this reminds me of what corporations do. They tend to cut their way to profitability at times because they always, especially if they're a publicly traded company, they like to say they're beholden to the shareholders. So when their quarterly statements come out and things are looking a little too much on the expense side, they tend to want to cut, especially labor, have people contribute more to their benefits, salary reductions, or just layoffs in general. But governments aren't corporations. They have a wholly different function. They fall outside the realm of capitalism for the most part when we're talking about, say, here in the United States. Certainly, corporations and government do work hand in hand and sometimes a little too closely. But the function of government in society is a different function than corporations. But it seems like what you were talking about in Chile and now in Greece, and certainly that has become the trend over the last 30, 40 years, is to treat government like a corporation, that you can cut your way to a balanced budget, that is.
Yes, and I think that this is a scary thing because states are now called to function as corporations, but states have social and welfare functions. They're responsible for providing free healthcare, education, work for everybody, public transportation. So basically, this public sphere that is so vital and so necessary to end in democracy. Also, what is interesting, at least to me as a linguist, in terms of the state working as a corporation, is the rhetoric around the state and what the state can do. So we hear a lot terms like efficiency, how to make the state efficient, how to balance the budget. Also, the success story that is... it's the catchphrase, at least in the Greek situation right now. The Greek prime minister keeps referring to Greece as a success story. And, that really brings me the chills because when I hear success, it smells human flesh to me because I'm thinking, whose success and at what cost? So if it's the success of global capital at the expense of Greek people, then, the Greek prime minister and I, or the working people of Greece, are talking about two radically different things.
You could look at images of what you exemplify, or what the examples you choose in your article of unemployment, of people getting disease now, the diseases that didn't exist in Greece they're having, and you could hold this up to the prime minister and say, "Is this what success looks like?" I mean, it's a ridiculous comment for him to make. He's looking at a balance sheet, and he's looking at, what do we owe in terms of debt? Have we been able to shrink that debt? But at what cost? I mean, look at all the people that are these are Greek citizens that are miserable. They're suffering at this point.
Actually, these are the people who work for this state to work. I mean, they are the wheels of the machine, basically. And, as you were talking, I was thinking that it's interesting. We could be talking about numbers for days here. You can show me the state budget and we can be talking about where to cut and, how to save money. But in my book, any theory that doesn't put at its core human beings, so any theory that doesn't include the human consequences, is a bad theory. So we can be talking about numbers as much as we want. If we don't see what these numbers cost in terms of human suffering, homelessness, drug abuse, HIV, misery numbers. We have to make the correlation of those numbers to real people.
This comes to another part of your article, and really it's in the title, that has to do with neoliberalism, and that is social necrophilia. Now, necrophilia is essentially like a sexual attraction to a corpse. So what you just laid out in terms of the misery within in Greece right now, and the prime minister saying this is a success, to me sounds like a textbook case of necrophilia. He is attracted to the misery of people. It's almost like the society is dying, yet he's excited about this.
Yes, and I think that's why the term necrophilia, as strong as it sounds, is a very interesting, it creates a very interesting metaphor. And I of course, I have to acknowledge, and I acknowledge this in my article, that my inspiration was Erich Fromm's work, his book, The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness. And as I was reading through that book, I thought, this really sounds familiar to me. This really sounds familiar. So borrowing this term necrophilia, which is really the love for the dead, not for death, for the dead, okay, the dead corpse, as you said. It really reminded me, it resonated with what's happening right now in Greece. So in Greece, we do have a necrophilus situation. Why? Because, first of all, this necrophilia is illustrated in the rise of fascism, authoritarianism, and militarization. And Fromm makes this connection actually in his own work. He says, fascists are really necrophilous people. They are necrophilic because they love death, and they use death in order to achieve what they want. They use violence. They don't have any other means to achieve their goals. So this is one layer, the rise of fascism, and we do see that in Greece a lot with the rise of the neo-Nazi party Golden Dawn and its connections actually to the official government. So this is one aspect that may be symbolic. But another aspect is a very real physical death and illness. So numbers really show a startling increase in suicides. I mean, they're 43% up. Some accounts talk about even 6,000 deaths since the beginning of the crisis. I think this is an incredible number. It's shocking. But then also, given that there are cuts made in public health care, people then cannot go to the hospitals. So their health is affected. They cannot get treatment. They cannot afford to pay for their medication. So there is an increasing number of people getting ill and not getting the treatment that they need. There's an increase in HIV cases. There is an increase in drug abuse, in mental health. And to me, all this makes up this necrophilus state, but social necrophilia. Now, it seems to me that what the Greek government is doing, of course, under the auspices of the IMF and the European Central Bank, is to try to have Greek people reconcile with this death, symbolic and physical.
Here in the United States, neoliberalism is very much a part of the Republican point of view, and certainly some of the Democrats too here in this country. We have an election coming up in November, and the numbers seem to be trending towards the Republicans maintaining, if not increasing, their numbers in the House of Representatives and taking over the Senate completely. Now, things can change. We're a few months out of November, but if this does happen, if the Republicans do become the majority in both houses of Congress, and you still have President Obama holding over on the executive branch, it just seems like, especially with Paul Ryan's budget that has come out, we're just going to see more austerity measures being enacted.
We are talking about a generalized crisis of capitalism, and the United States is part of it. I see two issues here. One is that in comparing Greece and the United States, we are talking about a country that's part of a monetary union, So we don't print our own money. So the United States, in that sense, is in a different situation. So austerity measures affect us here in a different way. But nevertheless, you're absolutely right. The Republican agenda is about cuts in the welfare and social functions of the state. And it seems to me that things are going to get worse. But at the same time, I don't think we have to wait and see these heightened, if you want, austerity measures when Republicans are going to be the majority, because we see them right now with the Obama administration. I mean, austerity measures, I think, have already cost the US economy close to 2 million jobs right now. And child poverty is very high. Income inequalities persist. And despite, I think, President Obama's rhetoric, the situation is not very good.
And you do talk a lot about a crisis of capitalism, and I think we see it here in the United States in terms of the so-called economic recovery that after the Great Recession. Now, granted, this was a horrible, horrible recession. It affected the entire world in many ways, and it's interesting to see what happens after a recession, how capitalism reconfigures itself after this crisis. And what we're seeing now is people who want to work full-time, people who have the ability to work full-time, aren't able to get full-time work. Companies are looking to hire just-in-time employment, a lot of part-time, a lot of seasonal help. And there's just not that kind of growth that should be taking off within the economy. It's almost as if people who run companies have said, well, if this is the new normal, then this is actually pretty good for my bottom line to have this kind of, too bad for all the people that want to work, can work, are able to work, and can't seem to find jobs. But boy, if I can just keep a skeleton crew in terms of a very small group of full-timers and then surround myself with a lot of part-timers or fill-in people, well, then, hey, I'm going down easy street here.
That labor is in a very vulnerable position because they are really disposable. So in a capitalist context, they become disposable people. They become human waste very often. And the same thing is happening right now in Greece. I mean, when we talk about 30% unemployment and going higher and higher, we are talking about a whole half of the country really living in the margins.
And that's the sad part, but also the lesson that people need to take into consideration as they go to the voting booth in November, as they write their congresspeople, and as they stay engaged within politics and say that I'm informed. I know essentially when you talk about cuts and that we're going to try to cut our way to profitability, but yet on the other hand, that corporations seem to be getting quite a bit of a largesse in terms of government support, in terms of tax breaks or in terms of direct subsidies. Like, for example, there was a report on NPR that talked about how Walmart profits from the SNAP program, which is essentially food stamps. Yes, people receive food stamps, but they spend them somewhere, and Walmart is a huge recipient of that government largesse. So that becomes a transfer a bit of wealth there.
Well, this is interesting, though, what you mentioned, because talking about neoliberalism. So in neoliberalism, you want a small state, right? You want to shrink the state. Yet you need this largesse that you just mentioned, but only if it is to welfare the corporations, but not the people.
I mean, part of the way in which Walmart makes its money is through the SNAP program. I mean, certainly they don't make the majority of their profits, but it's certainly part of, when they do their annual reports or even their quarterly reports, that factors in there. And there's a tremendous amount of money that can be made through these SNAP programs. And it's not just Walmart. I mean, I'm sure that Target, other retailers benefit from the SNAP program in similar ways. But I think Walmart is just the biggest example because more people shop there than they do at other places. Well, Panayota, I want to thank you so much for being on Truthout Interviews. This is a very shocking, lively, but also ultimately illuminating discussion about neoliberalism, Greece, and the crisis of capitalism.
Thank you very much, Ted.
And that's Truthout Interviews for another week. Thanks for watching. I'm Ted Asregadoo, and we'll see you next time.